Brutalism. When people think of this style of architecture, they often think of dystopia, concrete, and a lack of human scale. Defined by exposed concrete, geometric shapes, and minimal ornament, many find this style hard to appreciate. This walking tour aims to change these misconceptions about this beautiful but often misunderstood style. When people visit the University of Toronto campus, they often look for the classically beloved buildings, such as the Richardsonian Romanesque Victoria College building or the neo Gothic Knox College. On this tour, we will highlight four often overlooked buildings that notably contributed to the style of brutalism globally. Each building has a unique voice in this fascinating architectural landscape, which represents the pinnacle of post-war optimism and experimentation in architecture. The four buildings selected, Massey College, Robarts Library, John M. Kelly Library, and the Medical Sciences Building, were completed from 1962 to 1971, a time of great growth for both Canada and the University of Toronto campus. This was the time of Canada's Expo 67, when faith in the future and all things new was at an all-time high. This optimism and embrace of new progressive styles of architecture is what fostered the environment that allowed so many unique brutalist buildings to be constructed on campus. For each building in this walking tour, you will be given information on the history behind its construction and design, its contributions to the wider movement of brutalism, and how its architecture fits into the context of the University of Toronto campus and the larger city of Toronto. The first building on the tour, both in order and chronology, is Massey College. This building, while not directly brutalist, incorporates many of the beginnings of brutalist-inspired elements in its design. Designed by prominent Canadian architect Ronald Thom and completed in 1962, this is a particularly fascinating building because, despite its embrace of modern architectural elements, its design and layout harkens back to medieval forms. This contrast between the flat, modernist roofline and the cloister-like layout make this building all the more fascinating in its context on the U of T campus. The building was designed as a residence for selected male graduate students at U of T. The building is on a small site surrounded by both a church and the St. Hilda's residence and is in a busy area, forcing it to be insular in design. According to the architect, the total concept is of a quad secluded by the building from outside noise and confusion, acting as a courtyard common room. The tightness of the site and the building's insular nature are also a conscious effort to foster a sense of community among the rather small college's population. While the exterior walls are relatively plain, if you walk along Hoskin Avenue, and you will be able to notice the roof of the dining hall peeking above the rest of the building. This prominent feature of Massey incorporates vertical rhythms which harken back to the Gothic style. Combined with simple detailing and brutalist elements, this perfectly highlights the contrast between the modernist style of the building and its medieval inspiration. As we move beyond to the next building in the tour, we will be seeing a much more progressive and forward-looking interpretation of brutalism. As you move down Hoskin Avenue and approach its intersection with St. George Street, you will notice Robarts Library. A behemoth of a building, Robarts is arguably the most notable brutalist building on the U of T campus. Completed in 1973, Robarts, being the massive building it is, was not designed by a single architect, but rather was a collaborative effort between two larger firms. Robarts is an example of where brutalism moves away from the past and embraces the principles of modernism. Contrasting to Massey College, Robarts is far more unapologetic about its use of concrete, which is exposed and highlighted all across the exterior of the building. The library was designed in order to prevent Canadian graduate students from fleeing south to more prominent American universities, and thus the rationale of U of T was to make a building that was one on the cutting edge, attracting the future's best and brightest. Therefore, the architects consciously attempted to design a building with as radical design as possible. The library is quite massive, with a capacity of up to 4.5 million volumes. The challenge for the architects, then, was to make such a large building have visual interest on the exterior and not to be overbearing in its context on campus. While still being progressive in its design, some attempts, such as the triangular nature of the building and the upward thrust of its concrete structural members, make it a fascinating interpretation of the brutalist style. The building is playful in its design, with many describing it as having a turkey-like design, as well as its purely decorative elements, diverging from a classically modernist interpretation of architecture, such as its functionalist front tower above the rare books library. Ultimately, this building shows that brutalism doesn't have to be purely functional in its design, and demonstrates that this architecture can be more unique than usually thought. After taking in the grandeur and scale of Robarts, it's time to head down to St. George Street to another brutalist behemoth, the Medical Sciences Building. Completed in 1969, this building, similar to Robarts, was also designed by two large architecture firms as opposed to a single architect. As hinted by the name, this building was constructed to accommodate the increased need for adequate research facilities at U of T, and the bold design of the building reflects this cutting-edge purpose. This building has the tough task of having a presence on the front campus lawn, surrounded by such iconic buildings as University College and Convocation Hall. Not only does it have to compete with these buildings, but it has to accommodate the unique research facilities in its design. The building contains 140 research laboratories, 40 teaching labs, and over 600,000 square feet of usable space. The building, which serves as a hub for life science students, presented unique challenges and opportunities for the architects. In contrast to Robarts' vertical monumentality, the Medical Sciences Building breaks up its gigantic structure through horizontal monumentality and sculptural elements. The building is split into three 9-story towers that contain the building's many facilities. On the building itself, the plain concrete of the building's facade is broken up by magnificent sculptural patterns designed by Ted Bueller, who taught at U of T's Department of Art and Archaeology. The building is also surrounded by beautiful brutalist sculptures in its environs that fit into the structure's overall aesthetic. This building ultimately shows how brutalism can be functional and adapt to varied and unique uses, while also incorporating sculpture and unique forms to break up its relatively massive design. This building certainly has a presence on the front campus and provides a more modernist contrast to the other more traditional forms of architecture that inhabit the space within its context there. After exploring the Medical Sciences Building on front campus, you should next cut across Queen's Park and approach the final building on the tour, the John M. Kelly Library. This building was designed by relatively unknown local architect John J. Ferrugia and completed in 1969. The building was commissioned as a response to the growing lack of space at St. Michael's College Old Library in Carr Hall. However, what really makes this building interesting is not its purpose, to provide more space for books, but the fact that it was designed to be as explicitly flexible as possible. While the building may seem unimpressive or simple from the outside, especially compared to some of the more creative interpretations of brutalism seen on this tour, the real interest is found in the way that the design of the library reflects its purpose. The building is constructed of reinforced concrete, and the entire building has a modular design, meaning the space inside is flexible and open. This has allowed a printing room, used by the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, to be constructed within the central core of the building. This fascinating contrast between the bold and progressive style of brutalism and the medieval methods of printing employed inside make this building all the more interesting. While the exterior window slats of the building draw visual interest as you approach, a particular gem is the sculpture that lies in the front plaza of the building. Designed by Canadian sculptor William McEachran, this entitled sculpture serves as a great complement to the wider building's design and acts as another fine example of public art on campus. As you finish looking at the austere, yet stunning Kelly Library, it is now time to reflect on what you have seen on this tour. Each of the four buildings are different from one another, and are all integral to the shaping of the way we see brutalism today. The progressive and bold Robarts Library and the monastery-like Massey College may not appear to have much in common. However, these two buildings, as well as all the other buildings on the tour, are bound together by this common language of brutalism. Despite this, each building on this tour is unique and offers its own contribution and voice in the brutalist movement. Not only do these buildings vary greatly in their architectural design and aesthetics, they also vary widely in their uses. On the University of Toronto campus alone, we see how buildings have been designed to function as libraries, medical labs, and graduate colleges, while all still retaining the distinctive brutalist appearance. While serving varying uses, these buildings still all exude a common optimism in their architecture that reflects the greater climate these buildings were built in. Architecture from this optimistic post-war period is often overlooked and understudied, making the study of these buildings all the more important. This is especially pertinent because of how threatened brutalist architecture is today. A re-examination of the heritage value of this style is desperately needed, This walking tour ultimately reveals the value that brutalism has and reveals some misconceptions about this misunderstood and threatened architectural legacy.